this meeting. And first, I would like to introduce my colleagues on the side of me, both sides. Over here, I have Councilor Michael Green, Councilor Steve Thompson, Councilor Khalid Bey, Councilor Timothy Rudd, and Councilor Joe Driscoll. And I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself.
Chris Ryan, County Legislature, 8th District.
Susan Lerner, Common Cause, New York.
Dustin Zarni, Onondaga County Board of Elections.
All righty, and before I turn this meeting over, first I would like to thank Susan Lerner from Common Cause for coming to offer us her expertise. And I would also like to thank Commissioner Zarni for his persistent pushing and all of you that's here tonight. We are here to discuss redistricting. Redistricting can be done every 10 years after the census. But in the city of Syracuse, we have not done redistricting going on 20 years. And in 20 years, our demographic areas have changed dramatically. Not to mention, the last time they were drawn by electeds. It is my belief that electeds should never draw their own district. So if this legislation moves forward, I will be working to bring on a nonpartisan, independent commission made up of community, business, academia, and others. So this is why we are here tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Well, thank you so much, President Hunt. I am asking for a volunteer to help hit the page button on the computer. So I'm leaning on a PowerPoint tonight, so you'll bear with me. You're just, when I say next slide, you'll just hit the page down. How's that? Great. All right, so redistricting reform in Syracuse. This is really an exciting topic and an exciting time. Right now we are in the midst, I think, of a national discussion regarding gerrymandering and how best to draw political district lines so that they fairly represent the voters and give every voter an opportunity to elect the best representative in the legislatures or city councils around the country. There's some important cases on redistricting which are pending in the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's really helped to highlight the importance of this issue. As President Hunt mentioned, it's very unusual that Syracuse did not redraw its lines 10 years ago. Redistricting happens every 10 years after the decennial census to reflect the changes in population that the census tracks. So next slide, please. Right, and hit it again. There we go. All right. After 2008, there's been a wave of local reform for redistricting. Hit it again. Independent redistricting is what people are really talking about. I've talked about the Supreme Court cases that deal with political gerrymandering. Really, the wave of the future is independent redistricting, where legislators and elected officials, as President Hunt said, are not drawing their own political boundary lines, but citizens get together and decide what is a fair map for their particular jurisdiction. Next. And this really was kicked off from the California Proposition 11 in 2007, which is the first one to set up a truly independent redistricting commission joining Arizona. So we had two states in 2007, California and Arizona, that were using independent citizen commissions to draw their district lines. Today we have 14 different jurisdictions, but what's really interesting is 12 of them are in California, and hit it again, and then Austin, Texas. And you will notice all of those locations are west of the Mississippi. We are east of the Mississippi. So if Syracuse were indeed to adopt an independent commission to draw its district lines, it would be the first jurisdiction east of the Mississippi and would be a leader. Right now, the current process, as you may be aware, is set forth in your city charter, and it sets a time frame and a relatively simple procedure for drawing the district lines, but it vests all of the discretion in the hands of the elected officials. And as we know through difficult experience, the elected officials can elect not to change anything, as was the case 10 years ago. Next slide, please. So the current process requires redistricting if after the census a district has less than 15% or less of the city's population, or 25% or more of the city's population. That's a pretty broad arrangement, and it gives you a lot of stretch, which is how I think you ended up without a redistricting 10 years ago. The district shall have no less than 17% of the city's population, nor more than 23%. And the council is exclusively in charge. Redistricting done by ordinance, and the mayor has no vote of approval or disapproval, and the public isn't really part of the process, except to the extent that they talk to their common council members. So the consequences of the current process are somewhat unfortunate. The maps do not reflect current communities of interest. They're 20 years out of date, and it's difficult to effectively represent constituents when the maps are so out of line with the actual demographic patterns in the city. So for instance, what we see in Council District 1, there's been an influx of new Americans, and that results in a serious overpopulation of that council district. And the changes that have taken place naturally in CD4 are not reflected in the district map, because there you've got a district where the increasing popularity of living downtown, something which wasn't really happening 20 years ago, has had an impact on the population, and the maps that are drawn should reflect that. So why adopt a local commission? Hit it again. You want to depoliticize redistricting. Now, you may hear a lot, oh, it's inherently political. To some degree, yes, but that doesn't mean that it has to be unfair, right? So you want to depoliticize in the sense that you want to have a fair set of standards, and to have the public feel that the map accurately reflects who the people of Syracuse are, how they live, where they gather. And a local commission increases public engagement and transparency. Just by the nature of being a citizen commission, it increases the interest which other citizens have in this process. It improves community representation, and it improves minority representation because everybody has a stake. So for instance, where you have a independent committee, like in Anaheim, you've added 2 minority districts. In Chula Vista, California, you've ended up adding 2 minority districts. And same thing in San Diego, where you've seen an uptick in minority districts and districts which reflect a very vibrant LGBTQ community in San Diego. Let's go on. And Merced, which is in the very heartland of the California Central Valley, added 1 minority district, and there it's very likely to be a Latino district. So at bottom, the real impact is that it improves the public's faith in their government and their trust in government, because they feel it's a more accurate representation and reflection of who the community is. So Austin, we believe at Common Cause, is a really excellent case study and model for what you may want to do here in Syracuse. It was the first city to really go for a independent commission, and it's been very successful. It was adopted by the voters in 2012, and it was an initiative placed on the ballot by the citizens of Austin, who formed a group called Austinites for Geographic Representation. The amendment required single-member districts, and it authorized the commission to do a complete redistricting in 2013. The results are striking. Over 500 Austinites applied to be on the commission. Over 550 people submitted testimony, along with countless maps which the citizens themselves drew to provide and support their testimony at crowded public hearings. 78 candidates ran for office in 10 newly created districts, and there were dozens of candidate forums in which many of the candidates participated throughout the city rather. And unlike the situation with the previous exclusively at-large council, the candidates obviously had to be dispersed throughout the city. With the at-large system that was replaced, all of the council members ended up being residents of only 2 of the new districts. Very imbalanced representation. 2014 voter turnout, which was the first election with the new districts, was higher than it had been in the previous city elections. And that was the fact, even though Texas had a new law which required a photo ID at the polls, which displaced turnout in other places. And then in 2018, the new city council was more ethnically and racially diverse, and the council has really been able to draw on its geographic legitimacy in taking action. Next slide, please. And as you can see from the quotes that we have here, the council members and the candidates who ran are uniformly positive in terms of the impact of the independent redistricting. There was so much interest among people whom I've met who have said, I never really followed city elections before, but this is really such an exciting time. Now I feel like I have a stronger voice. Is the comment from one of the candidates who ran in a city district race. Next slide, please. And the participation by the public in the process was really, really inspiring. There was a tremendous amount of engagement and a serious group of citizens who took the process very, very seriously, and who attended and really worked hard to balance the interests. And that really is a part of the key to this, is having the right people who serve on the commission, having a selection process which allows you to have citizens who reflect the diversity of your city, who are drawing the maps, and who engage the public in a really interesting and important process of talking about how do we live and work in Syracuse? Where are the important locations in our city? Where are people gathering? Where do they live? And how do we reflect that politically in a way that's fair? So Austin now has a generally fair map for the city council districts, very well regarded process, and I believe that it forms a good model for what you may want to do here in Syracuse. So how should you go about this? There are a lot of different ways. First, obviously, you're going to need to change your charter. So the charter amendment, which is starting to be discussed, I think, is obviously the important first step. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do that. One way is certainly the way that I believe is being discussed, which is really rather than trying to outline every single detail of the process of appointing and running the commission, is to give the Common Council the flexibility through its normal process to write an ordinance that would set up the independent commission. So that would then, following the charter amendment, lead you to legislation, which would actually set up the commission, would give you an opportunity for a robust legislative process, hearings, input from the public, and really craft a process and a commission structure that works for Syracuse. Following that, obviously, is the implementation of the plan, crafting the policies and procedures to implement the Independent Citizens Reform Commission, really fleshing out the basic structure that your ordinance would set up. And you follow that up with partnering with community and advocacy groups to educate the public about the process and encourage diverse applicants to apply to be on the commission. And my prediction is, just like in Austin, in the state of California, and so many places that have independent redistricting, you are going to see an outpouring of citizens who, when they have an opportunity to be on the commission, are going to apply. And that is actually one of the exciting things about this process, is how engaged people become. Next slide, please. So here are some of the things that we believe that you should be thinking about when you are looking at your charter revision provision. You want an independent authority that actually has authorization, not just an advisory commission. You want fairness. You need to be sure that the commissioners are independent and impartial. So getting the selection method right is correct, and being sure that you have the right qualifications. And again, there are models in the cities that have done this, that run from Merced, California, through San Diego to Austin, that can help guide your discussions and give you some ideas of the kind of things that you would want to put in. And you want to be sure that in your selection process, you have built in a requirement for accurate representation of the people who actually live here, that you have commission diversity based on who are the people living in Syracuse, not some abstract, but what your demographics actually are, and that you want to have neighborhood and community-centric redistricting criteria in the ordinance that you finally adopt. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about the charter language, there are some specific suggestions which we have, and we have been in touch with folks about the specific language, and really compliment the staff and your council for the diligence and the creativity of this approach. We really suggest that rather than having a statement like 6 months after the census data comes down, or using some other signpost, that you have a very specific date by which you plan to impanel the commission. It just is easier in our experience if you're working with a calendar rather than with a date which could shift. We have a general idea of more or less when the census data is likely to come down, and if you've kicked off the process a little bit early, well, you're just that much more prepared and not worrying about a shortened time period if the census data comes down a little later than anticipated. You want to be sure that you've got clear criteria for independence in the charter revision. So we recommend bar conflicts of interest that would prevent commissioners from being fair and impartial. And again, there are various ways to do that, and I think that the Corporation Council has some good ideas. Of course, because you are going to be relying on an ordinance, you want to have the ability to amend the ordinance, but we would suggest that you don't want language in there that would encourage frequent revisions of the ordinance in the process. Because once you've developed a good process, you don't want to come back over and over again and pick it apart and reshuffle it. You really want to have some continuity. And when you're thinking about the criteria for maps, you do definitely want to have districts which are more or less equal in size, but because you're dealing with districts which are much smaller in size than the congressional districts, where the requirement is that they have to be absolutely equal in size, plus or minus no more than one voter, what we find is that in smaller districts, like city council districts, you need to have some flexibility. If you're really going to reflect the communities of interest and the patterns by which people live, work, and gather, then you need to have more flexibility than absolute equality. Yes, they have to be equal, but you need a reasonable variability, and the case law can be helpful in that regard. So once you are beyond the basic facts of the charter revision, when you're really thinking about the commission, we think that you need to be thinking about 5 questions. Who is drawing the maps, and how are they being selected? And often this ends up being, in some ways, the most interesting and sometimes the most complicated discussion, because so much rests on who is drawing the maps and how they're selected. Who's going to be in the commission? How are you going to decide that? And so much follows once you've got the commission properly set up and they are independent, then everything flows more easily from that. What powers does the commission have? There are some commissions which actually draw the maps but then recommend them to the council. We recommend a truly independent commission. They draw the maps and then the maps are go into effect. What criteria should be applied in drawing the districts? At Common Cause, in the last redistricting cycle, we actually drew reform maps. We got very familiar with the process and how you apply the criteria. And one of the things that we learned very quickly was it's not only the criteria themselves, but the order in which you apply them. So, because nothing can happen simultaneously, you basically run through a list of criteria and try and fix the map one by one by one. And which criteria you have that has precedence radically changes the map. So it's the criteria and the ordering of the criteria. And then what can you do? How do you determine how transparent and what public input will be provided in the process? Do you want to have very general language, or do you want to have some basic requirements, a floor of number of hearings, of locations of hearings? These are things that you want to be thinking about. And then, how should the final map be chosen? Some commissions decide that you need a supermajority. Some commissions require specific voting rules as to how to ensure that the map will be fair and equitable. And these are the things that you'll be dealing with. And that, again, there are excellent models, and my organization and others who are prepared to help and to provide suggestions and help you through the process. What values? Because what we're really talking about, after all, when we're talking about redistricting, is what are the political values that Syracuse wants to hold up and to be sure are followed in this process of setting political boundary lines. Fairness, equal representation, transparency, racial equity, diversity are many of the values which are mentioned when we deal with independent redistricting commissions that are citizen-run. But are there other aspects that here in Syracuse you want to be cognizant of? And that's part of the discussion, which I hope you'll be having over the next several months as you work out and pass a charter revision commission, and then a citywide discussion in terms of the values when you're actually putting together the ordinance and figuring out how your commission is going to run. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you and to share our experience, and we look forward to working with you if indeed, as I hope it does, this process goes forward.
Thank you, Susan. And before I move on, because I just want to say this, okay? Thank you for being here. We're not going to have questions tonight. We will be going out. We will be doing 5 hearings. So we will be in the communities. We'll be out talking about this. So write down all your questions and get at us then, okay? All right, thank you. And I'm going to go this way, and I'm going to start with Dustin.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited that the city of Syracuse, my hometown, is considering this. I grew up on South Collingwood Ave in Eastwood, which was in the 5th Common Council District. And then when I came back to Syracuse, I lived on Court Street, right on the west side of Court Street, so I was just inside the 2nd Council District. And then I moved to Oak Street, which was in the 1st Council District. Then lived over in Strathmore on Hubble Ave in the 3rd Council District, and now I'm on the east side again, back in the 5th Council District. So I've hit almost all of them. I didn't get the 4th. Yeah, maybe when I retire and I can go to downtown living, I can end up in the 4th district. But the reason I say that is, I've seen this community grow, and so many different changes that have happened to the city of Syracuse. And as I became commissioner, and I got to see the voting patterns and which communities are registering and who in those communities are registering, it became very clear to me that our 5 Common Council districts have not been touched in a very long time and may not be representing all of the communities as well as they could be. And while our map, is not as selective as some other maps that we might have in our community, it does need addressing. And the best way to do this, as we're looking at the national talk about gerrymandering and talking about unfair districts and talking about representatives selecting their people instead of people selecting their representatives. The best way to move forward, in my opinion, in any level of government is independent redistricting. And for Syracuse to put their stamp on this would be a big boon for the city that I've grown up in and loved. And it won't just be good for Syracuse. It'll be a beacon that we can show to other governments in the county, in the state, and along the whole eastern seaboard about what we can do here and what a progressive change this can be for our city and for our citizens. The great thing about the approach that we're having is that after we change the charter, and I do have to stress that we do have to move on this because we have to have this into the Board of Elections by July 8th with the new law that has been passed, so we can't wait too long to pass the charter change and then put it before the voters and get it on the ballot for this year. But if we do this, then we get this second opportunity to craft an ordinance that is good for the city of Syracuse. I think the City of Austin motto is the gold standard. It really, fits well into our own city structure. The City of Austin motto relies on a city auditor to help select by random the commission members, and then the commission members select the other half of that to fill out the needs of diversity and members of each district. I think that is something that we have a city auditor. It already fits right into our model. We have a New York State. If we need to hire auditors to help with this, we have a New York State Public Board of Auditing, like Texas does as well. So we have a great option that has already been crafted, and we already saw how it worked and how well it worked. I hope that the city council will look at the Austin model after we pass the charter change, and if the voters approve it, look to adopt that model with, caveats and changes to make it right for the city of Syracuse in January. And I think if we do this, if the city of Syracuse leads by example, Susan has been great to go over the process, so I'm going to talk about what it's going to do for our community. I think it will engage our citizens. Urban centers always have a problem with voter turnout, and a lot of that is because we don't engage with our citizenry. This will have the citizens draw districts that reflect their own communities. Will it look like the map that is over there? Maybe. Maybe there will only be minor changes. Maybe there will be more structural changes. The 5 districts will stay the same, but maybe they'll change in the way and shape that the communities want. But the best thing about that is the communities are going to decide that. And they're not going to decide it based on incumbency. They're not going to decide it based on partisanship, because these are going to be districts that we live with for the next 10 years. And when they go out there and they make this choice, then they're invested in it. And the process after they make this choice, engaging the community and coming back to the council, that is going to further invest the rest of the citizenry in their leadership. And I think that can only be a good and proper use of government power. And a lot of people have said, well, the council is giving up its power by doing this. I would say that you are showing how to use power by example, because you are going out there and you're saying this is what's best for the community, not best for the common council, not best for these councilors. And you're using that power to do what you were sent here to do, which is to represent the citizens of the city of Syracuse and give them a further voice in your selective process. So I urge the council to take a look at the ordinance that has been drafted before you. I have to thank Joe Barry, who's been really helpful in putting this together, along with Common Council President Helen Hudson, who's been pushing for this and pestering just as much as I've been pestering President Hudson. But this has been a long standing issue, and I think whatever maps that we come up with in this independent redistricting and the process that we come up with is going to be able to be shown to other governments that this is the proper way to handle this vital and necessary function of our democracy. So thank you.
Thank you. Legislator Ryan.
Madam President, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, inviting me, fellow colleagues, esteemed members of the City Council. Thank you, and thank you everybody who came out. Good turnout, great turnout, and it's certainly an issue that we all need to take notice of, because what happened on the county well, let me just start, is probably less than a good process, right? And the end result wasn't great. It wasn't good at all. So I want to say that was sort of where I started. So let me just back up a little bit. I've been working on this for the better part of probably 2 years now. As we come towards redoing the census, and when we're going to start redoing the district maps, I thought that would be a good time to start the conversation so that we're prepared, so that we don't repeat the same mistake that we did 10 years ago when we redid the district lines. So, as I stated, and I was on my phone, not that I wasn't paying attention, Ways and Means minutes of the county legislature, January 29th of this past year, January 29th of the 19, you could see what was put into the minutes, and the councilors or the legislators that thought that the process was good last time in the wrong. So, what I said then, and I'll say it again, is when the Syracuse paper starts nicknaming the districts like a crustacean and an eagle taking flight in a peninsula and various other nicknames because they're drawn so bad, then that isn't a process that we should be proud of. And we can put forth a better product. And my plan, or my proposal, was to enact, and I'll say this too, it was going to be extremely ambitious for us to change the charter with an independent commission because, that just wasn't going to happen. So what my recommendation was to enact a 7-person panel, much to Madam President's philosophy. We have really, really good governance groups here in the city of Syracuse and the county of Onondaga. Groups like the League of Women Voters and our academia and Maxwell, and we have really, really good people and great advocacy groups right here that we could rely on that could do better and that would be more, would represent the overall county in a more fair, equitable, and just way. So my recommendation, or my resolution, my proposal, was to enact a 7-person agreed-upon bipartisan panel. You could not have served in public office for the last 10 years. Had to be agreed upon. Every meeting was going to be open, transparent, for everybody to see. We're not hiding anything here. Full transparency, and to make recommendations how that we could redo our charter. So that we could redo our charter, that we could do better, so that we could enact more fair and more equitable and better legislative districts that better represent the residents of the county of Onondaga. So that was my proposal. That started in 2017. The final product was put forth. It was brought to Ways and Means on January 29th. We necessarily didn't take a vote on it, and my proposal, my resolution, failed on a 12-5 vote along party lines. So, but it's just a minor setback. It doesn't, it's a little bit more of a minor setback, right? But knowing the odds, and, I don't gamble and I don't play cards a lot, but I do know that 12 beats 5. So, but I am not going to stop. I won't stop. I won't let that get in the way. I have Helen and President Hudson and Dustin and I have been speaking regularly. I think that there's a process that we can come up with. I will do everything that I can do to help, anything that I can do to get out there, everything I can do to redo our, and listen, I'll just bring it back. I can change it slightly. I can bring it back. And there's a lot of things that I can do, and I'm going to. But I won't stop trying, and that's where I am with the county.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues for questions, but I'm going to echo what Commissioner Zarni said. Joe Barry, thank you very, very much. All righty, Councilor Driscoll.
Thank you all very much for the presentation. I appreciate all of your work, and Legislator Ryan for pushing on for this for so long. All of you. I was curious, my understanding, my first thought as fiduciary agents is regarding costs around an effort like this. Was it my understanding that Austin was mostly voluntary pro bono, and what would costs look like if we were to pursue this initiative?
Yes, the Austin ordinance, the commissioners, in fact, it's right in the ordinance, they do not get any monetary reimbursements for serving on the commission. There are some minor, reimbursements for expenses, and the staff of a commission would be decided in your budget lines. They can hire staff, but I don't know what they've done in Austin, but I believe it was minor. It's a very short window of time that they have to look at this. So we're not talking, any more costs that would be on the books than the city would already spend in a redistricting process with city personnel. So, I think, city personnel could serve as support staff, the council staff could serve as support staff. But if they needed to hire, massive redistricting, if you were doing something different, like changing from, 5 to 10 or something like that, then the city would have to hire staff as well. So I don't see it as being anything more than what you normally would spend in redistricting.
Yeah, I was going to say, you may, in your own process, want to have a consultant, right, who is a map drawer, who has been through the process before and aware of the legal requirements at the federal level. And, so that would be the expense that you would want for your own process would be available to the commission. So I wouldn't anticipate that you would have extraordinary expenses over and above what you would normally do, whatever the cost of the hearings are, that you would invite the public to as part of your process. So it should not be a significant additional expense.
Thank you.
You mentioned Austin going from an at-large model to district model. Do maybe the outsider and the insiders locally, do you just envision us having the independent authority just redraw the lines for the 5 districts, or do you imagine larger changes than that?
And Sue, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what happened there in Austin is they went from an all at-large model to an all-district model. Here in Syracuse, we already have a hybrid model where we have 4 at-larges and 5 districts. The independent commission would not have authority to change that. Only the council would have authority to change that through a charter change. The independent commission, you would want to put into your language of your ordinance the ability for them to adapt if you did change that. And I believe, there is that ability to do that in there. So when you're talking about the Austin model, they went from an all at-large to a district, which necessary. So they were drawing their districts for the first time in 2012. That would not be the case here in Syracuse, and that's why the ordinance that you would draw would be germane to the city of Syracuse. So I would imagine, unless this charter would be envisioning that, this charter change would be envisioning that the the basic structure of 4 and 5, 4 at-larges and 5 districts would stay in place. But at a later time, the council could change that if the council always have that ability to change that. And then if you changed it before the census was up in 2021, then the independent commission could then draw different lines if you were adding or eliminating numbers of district councils.
From a common cause point of view, we don't really have a position. We're not suggesting that you should go to an all-district model. That is really part of the decision that Syracuse makes for itself.
I got it.
I can share.
Yeah.
Right. First, to the commissioner's point, naturally there were concerns in regards to council losing power. I'm certainly a person who have expressed concerns about the ways in which the legislature has lost power in the past that I still don't think is really recognized by the people or even people in elected office. But I will say this, relative to this effort, I think it provides a lot of great opportunities. One is the civic learning opportunity for constituents involved. There are many of us who, believe that we're aware of how government works, but there's some who often find out that when you encounter people, you find out that things work quite differently from what was assumed. And so this is a great opportunity in that respect. To the point mentioned, the opportunity to eliminate partisanship is very important. And for the many who hear the term gerrymandering and not under the assumption that it's not known, but at the crux of it, it implies a district being drawn in favor of one specific party in comparison to another. And that has happened here, with all due respect, on our county level in our last redistricting. And so the opportunity to prevent that kind of partisanship, I think, is very important. Also, this is really a real returning of the power back to the people. When you have citizens involved in the process, learning the process, making decisions about how the districts are drawn, I think the importance of that, and to the point made earlier about our effort, our consistent effort of reestablishing trust in government and the people, I think that goes without saying. I do have one question relative to the existing legislation, and this is specific to not less than 17, no more than 23, which is, that difference has always been a concern of mine even before now, especially in a district council race. You're talking about a difference of 6%. And so I can make assumptions about why that is, but I want to hear why the margin is so wide. And just to provide some perspective, standard rule, an election district is approximately 2,000 people. So 6%, you're talking about a 600-person difference. 600 people can win an election in a district council. So when you talk about fairness and balance, I think you have to question whether it's in fact fair and balanced. So I wonder why the margin's so wide.
So that does go to what you need to do in order to accurately reflect communities of interest. The legal standard that's established by case law is districts which are plus or minus 5%. A 10% deviation will stand.
Gotcha.
In a voting rights case. We at Common Cause actually have recommended a 3% plus or minus deviation to give map drawers enough ability to be sure that the communities are accurately represented, but that they are as equivalent, the districts are as equivalent in size as they can be, while still not cutting up communities artificially, right? So if you have a very strict standard, like, as you do for the congressional districts, which are much, much larger, plus or minus one voter, you get some very strange cuts in your district, where your district boundary lies. If you do that with a smaller district, then you are very artificially cutting communities. And so you're balancing the desire to keep a community together with the need to have fairly equivalent districts, but not, such a stringent standard that you're hamstrung.
And you do want some deviation in there, because then the council or the commission will be able to, make determinations on future population growth. We may know that the Inner Harbor is being developed, and so the second district is going to grow over the next 10 years. And having some deviation in there would allow for that. Or we may know that, a certain highway may be coming down, and, further developments might happen based on that. So these are things that will allow the commission to take future planning into account.
So the specific language that we recommend in the charter revision is, rather than each district shall be equal in population, it's really each council district shall have reasonably equal populations, except where deviation is required to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act or allowable by law. Right now, what's suggested in what has been very expertly drafted, we think is a little too tight. It will really constrain your map drawers artificially in a way that doesn't serve the interests of the communities.
So what's actually presented is different from what we have here.
No, what I'm
Reasonably
suggesting is, I'm
Okay.
suggesting a change
Got you.
to what you have there.
Yeah,
And the language I quoted is actually directly out of the Austin statute.
Yeah.
I think, Counselor, the 17 to 23, and Joe, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, that's referencing the old language in the charter, and the new language that is in the draft that may be changed before it's submitted to the council doesn't have a deviation in there at all, and we're suggesting a deviation of about 3%.
Okay, that's what and what I assumed in terms of one of the reasons for why some deviation is needed made sense. Otherwise, you end up with more eagles and peninsulas. So I saw that to be one of the reasons. And relative to choosing the appropriate map, you've answered that question as well. I would think that the one with the smaller amount of deviation would be considered.
A good map drawer is always trying to do that, but again, cognizant of you don't want to artificially cut out 5 blocks of a community that really belongs together.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
She's done already. Okay, and we're going to go right next to me, Councilor Thompson.
Thank you. Madam President, I just jotted a couple of things down, nothing, what my concern is more, and I sent Dustin a thing earlier, more about process, I think, than not process to getting this onto the voting. But process and how the selection occurs, how the input is. I know we're going to look to give public hearings and all this, and I've been to all these for lots of years. Does it stimulate people to get out? That's the thing. Can we stimulate people to get out, or do we end up flat where we don't, and then do we fall on our face? I don't want to see that happen. So that's one of the concerns that I've had. I have watched groups in all different endeavors, and they fall on their face because they try and get people to actively show up. That's just a statement.
Yeah.
But I had two questions, I think. One is, you showed Austin's change in 2014, I think you said. And then you showed the 2016, 2014 data. What happened in 2018? Did you have that data? You said in 14 it increased because they went to the new districting.
Right.
So
I don't, but I can find that out easily.
Okay. Yep. And
And 2018 was a pretty high turnout race everywhere.
Yeah.
Across the country,
So
for
we would
factors that may have nothing to do with redistricting, right? Because you didn't have new districts to excite people, but you had other things that people cared about.
Sure. Absolutely. Let's see. The other one is, I'm all for the people drawing and putting it together, but I would need to explore, or hear why when it was done, it wouldn't come back to the council. So the council, that would take 5 votes to throw it out. So that probably wouldn't happen. But I would just like to hear the justification behind that. And do other models use that? Where that comes back?
Other models use it, but we don't call them independent redistricting models for that, for that reason. And New York City, I believe, has a version of that. And the problem with that model is that if we're looking towards the future, we're looking towards future councils, we don't want a council that could reject what the people have put together and not accept it. And while I understand the wish on this, I believe that it's more important to give the final say to the people, and that's my personal opinion. But I believe if we have a truly independent redistricting commission, then we take out the charge that the leaders are selecting their representatives as opposed to the representatives selecting their leaders. And once we can get that out of the way, then we can engage people in a civic process, and their voice really can matter because they have selected which communities should be together and be represented, and then those communities can select their representative. And if you have a break where the council could intercede, then you have the tuggings of temptations of incumbency and self-interest that is there in anybody. And I think if you had an independent commission, then that independent commission would not be able to take into account. In fact, it would be barred from taking into account incumbency and partisanship and in the past in predicting the future. So I that is why I'm for independent redistricting, and that's why I've tried to advocate for this process. And it took me a long time to get to that point as well. 20 years ago, I don't think I was there. But now Now, it just, when I've seen it enacted in other communities, Austin, California, on the congressional level, in Arizona and other places, it's really worked very well for those communities, and they've been engaged in their process more.
Nothing in life is certain, and we can't guarantee that the residents of Syracuse will react the way we have seen the residents of other municipalities respond to the opportunity to draw their own maps. I personally was stunned with the outpouring of Californians when the new redistricting commission was set up. California set up a website to do a preliminary cut of people who were interested in being on the commission. And we really thought at the time, those of us who were involved in redistricting, we're going to do really well if as many as 5,000 or 6,000 people from across the state apply. So when 30,000 Californians filled out the preliminary questionnaire, we were really stunned. Austin is not a large city, but 500 people wanted to be on the commission. And personally, for me, one of the most successful workshops I ever ran was a workshop in a community in New York City, a very diverse community where we had to translate into 2 different languages to have our workshop, and it was a mapping workshop of helping the communities identify how their community should be reflected on a map. When you ask people these questions, where do you shop? Where do you live? Where do you worship? Where do you go to school? They want to tell you. And I learned things about that community. It was really fascinating that I, as a map drawer, was looking at and said, well, there's a big shopping area here. Should that be included? And they said, no, none of us go there. The bus lines don't work well for that. So we don't ever shop there. So that shouldn't be part of our district. The community tells you they know what is important to them, and they're very eager, we found, to actually visualize it and share that with you. So I think, if Syracuse responds the way other communities do, it will be a really vigorous and interesting process for everybody.
Yeah, I just want to say the other thing too, specific to not just City of Syracuse, County of Onondaga, Austin, Texas, California. There are multiple cases, court cases that have gone beyond just Supreme Court, State Supreme Court, Appellate Court in, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there's some North Carolina, Virginia, Wisconsin, just to name a few. I think all across, and it's not specific to one party, there's been challenges to both parties who've drawn both districts. I think as a whole, across this country, I think people are beginning to push back on the notion of gerrymandering. And I think it's just, it doesn't serve us well. The very, Councilor Bay, the definition, by definition, that one group draws a district that isn't representative of that community for the sole purpose of benefiting those people in power that are drawing the district. It's not right. It's not. And I think all across the country, the dynamic has changed. And I think that what we're trying to do here in the city and the county is, I think we're on the right track. So I just wanted to say that. It's important to know also what's going on across the country.
And I would just comment that it may not take me 20 years because I'm there now. I agree with this. I'm just asking the question because somebody's going to ask that question. Why isn't this? Why don't you guys do? Because as Councilor Bay said, I mean, we have lost a lot of our legislative powers over the years, and we allow them to go. This is possibly a very good one to let go. But so I'm just bringing it up.
It's a fair question, and it's not one that won't be asked throughout the entire process. So thank you for the question, because it was, that is the kind of stuff that we're all going to have to answer as this process goes forward.
That's all right. Get noisy, Mike.
Sorry about that. So first, I just want to thank President Hudson for bringing up this initiative. I think that when elected officials are able to not use their power for political means and able to give some of that power to people, it's inspiring to people in terms of inspired by democracy, and we need a lot of inspiration based on what's going on in the country right now. So I think that this is, it's just a very positive development, I think. So I just want to thank President Hudson for that. One thing I want to touch upon, so where I live, my district counselor is Counselor Driscoll, and the person directly across the street from me is district counselor is Counselor Allen, and that's stupid, right? I mean, there's no other way to say it. And I think from a community standpoint, the fact that a street like that, first of all, if the trash doesn't get picked up, the fact that the street has to call 2 different people doesn't make sense. It's inefficient. It doesn't give them a direct line of who people should be talking to. But I also think from a counselor standpoint, district counselors are only one person, and they can't be everywhere all the time, and there's always a million different neighborhood meetings. And when you're cutting up different neighborhoods like that and forcing everyone to go all around the city, it just makes it harder for you to represent the community that you really should be representing, right? So I think that it's something, obviously, by definition, you can't put a rating on qualitative how well a counselor is doing, but my suspicion is that if we did a better job of creating these districts, the counselors would just do a better job because they would have more time to focus on one neighborhood or a group of neighborhoods that makes sense. So it's a long way of saying I support this.
And yeah, unfortunately, when we're drawing district lines or election district lines or council lines, you have to go down a street in the middle of the street. So there are going to be at least, a whole bunch of streets that have that happen. But what the independent commission can do is be more strategic in which streets they go down, and what, instead of going down a neighborhood street, maybe they go down a business thoroughfare, and then they're keeping more communities together. While and they can take that into account and specialize in while you, the council, is focusing on running a very diverse and very challenging city, they can focus on this mapping issue for 6 months and come up with the best maps possible.
And I would say not only that too, but if someone were to, the boundaries are always going to have to be somewhere, and they're always going to have to exist. But at least this way, if someone asks, well, why does the district look like this? You can say, nonpartisan experts decided it, not, well, it was good politics, so this is where we cut the line. So I think that also helps people, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to echo what Councilor Green said, because it was one of my, not so much of a concern, but just a comment. As a district counselor, and especially with the 4th district is very, very diverse. And this would be very helpful. It would help me personally to be able to do my job more efficiently. But there are so many different needs in every area of the 4th district. So with this process, I think this would make it a lot easier, but more so efficient for the district counselors to be able to make sure that they can kind of monitor their areas better. For me, example, I have some of Westcott, I have downtown, I have Southside, I have Southwest, and it's all one district, but those are all 4 totally different areas, totally different issues, and different challenges. So this would make it a lot better, especially for the district counselors. And as far as I understood what you were saying, but I feel like if it did come back to the council for a vote, it's kind of an illusion that we gave people the power, because it's just like, here, you have the power to draw this, but you got to come back and bring it to us, and that can kind of show a lot of bias. So if I'm in the 4th district and I don't like the way they drew my lines, I'm not voting for it. You know what I mean? So I don't think we should do it that way. But I do understand why you mentioned it.
And I think, with Councilor Thompson playing devil's advocate, it just really points out that how unique of a situation this can be in Syracuse, and that that we would be the only city on the Northeast that has done this and been this progressive and this egalitarian in giving this power back to the citizenry, and that's why I'm excited by it, because I think not only is it good for the citizenry, but it's going to put Syracuse on the map.
For something good.
For something good.
Yeah.
Right. Let's face it, we have a poverty problem inside the city of Syracuse. And that poverty problem has gotten worse over the last 20 years. But we didn't draw maps to help the citizens during those 20 years, that may, to be able to give them more say to the people. And, poverty drives population, and it drives people out of the city, it drives people to different portions of the city. And we don't have I'm sure when the census comes out, we're going to have maps that are really out of balance. They're already out of balance when it comes to voter registration. And we know the population will exploit that because people that are in poverty tend to be not enrolled as voter registration. So the places that are going to have even farther, desperate or disparate, tracts of population in these districts. And going back to those people, the citizenry, and asking them to say which neighborhoods belong together, I think that's just going to be a benefit for the council.
All righty, so we're going to wind down, but I just want to ask the question, and maybe I should have done this before I came here, because I don't know, maybe James, you may have to help me. Do we know, since the last redistricting, what the influx, because I know we've had a ton of refugees come in. Do we know what the influx is of different folks coming into our city?
So,
Go ahead.
the American Community Survey does track that sort of thing. I mean, I've seen some maps that have to do with the expansion of low-income neighborhoods. I know that there are definitely those figures are available. I just don't happen to have them, at my fingertips. But yes,
And I'm sure they all came in under over the 20-year mark.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
yes, no
And
question.
There's no doubt that the influx of new Americans on the north side has radically changed what used to be Old Italy. We have a huge Vietnamese population and Burmese population up there. We have, large settlements of young professionals in the old factories as those apartments have been created on the, on the west side. I don't know how much the population has shifted, but I do know it has, and I do know that we're going to see that over the last 20 years, new communities have been created, and they may be better to be grouped together so they can get better representation. And I think we're going to see that when the census comes out.
And I know working with Hope, and OSHA's back there, maybe she can help me out here, but I know working with Hope that we found out that we have a big, what the population, we have a huge population from the Caribbean over on the south side.
Right.
Yep.
So there's a huge population there.
Yeah.
So we're shifting, and we need to figure out where the shift is and how to pull it together. So,
Yeah.
anything else?
So, Madam President, I do have, some specific language suggestions, as I had mentioned, and is that something we should just discuss on the record, or something to share with you separately?
Well,
Mayor,
huh?
you might as well.
Go for it.
Okay. So, I don't have the
It's in here.
language directly in front of me, but I do have specific references. One of the things that I had mentioned in my presentation was the need to have a specific date rather than saying 6 months after. So whether that's June 1 or July 1 of the year that ends in 1 or the year that ends in 2, depending on when you want your cycle to be. Knowing that the census is the year that ends in 0. The data usually comes down mid-year, the year that ends in 1, right? So then you figure out when do you want to have your commission impaneled. New York City does it very late, all right? They draw their maps quite late in the process, after just about every other place does. I don't know why, but that happened to fit the calendar for New York City's municipal election. So you want to think about where do your municipal elections fall. The easiest thing is to say June 1 or July 1 of the year that ends in 1. And then you've got your commission set up, and whenever the data comes down, you're able to handle it. Or, within no later than September 1 of the year that ends in 1, because that gives people time to actually work with the data. So that's one suggestion. And then the other suggestion is the language that I read earlier about the size of the districts being reasonably equivalent rather than having them be a strict equivalency.
I have nothing further to say. Just thank you very much for discussing this, being open to discussing it, and thinking about putting this forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing and hearing.